Time didn't announce anything that night. It simply paused. The streetlight hummed, a tired neon flicker on the corner, and there was a hush between one breath and the next. Eyes met, and the noise of the city shrank to a soft murmur that lived somewhere behind the ribs. No grand speeches, no cinematic declarations, only a stillness so complete it felt like a promise. That was the first lesson this love taught. Not everything worth keeping arrives with thunder. Some things enter like dusk, and only later does it become clear that the sky has changed. The second lesson came gradually. In the ordinary ways, two lives leaned toward each other. A chipped mug set on the table, always on the left because the right handle was cracked. A coat draped over shoulders, warm from someone else's heat. A cotton shirt borrowed and never returned, soft at the collar where fingers had learned the curve of a throat. The body remembers small mercies long after the mind forgets dates and hours. In those days, closeness spoke in verbs no louder than breathe, near, stay. Morning stretched open like held notes. Tea steeping, fragrant and golden. Toast done a little too dark because patience ran out before the timer. Laughing over burnt edges, over forgetfulness, over the way the spoon clinked against the mug, while humming a melody that didn't have a name. Touch didn't ask for attention. It arrived and settled, the ordinary miracle of a palm resting on a back as the world woke. That kind of love doesn't perform, it practices, it returns, it learns the shape of silence and makes a home inside it. Afternoons were for shared errands that turned into dates by accident. Groceries for two but carried like a secret. Tomatoes chosen by the give of the skin. Basil held under the nose before nodding approval. A loaf pressed gently to the chest and judged by the whisper of its crust. There was a market stall where the vendor tucked in an extra peach for luck, and winked as if luck were needed for anyone who smiled like that. The walk back was always slower than the walk there. Steps fell into rhythm without asking. Love has a metronome hidden somewhere under the breastbone, and once it sets the tempo, even the traffic seems to move in time. Nights were soft-spoken. Reading side by side until the room became a pool of lamplight, until sentences blurred and eyelids lowered, and the book slid face down, surrendered. Sometimes music played, small and steady, and the furniture learned a new purpose as two bodies swayed in the narrow space between chair and shelf. No audience, no choreography, just warmth and a heartbeat that turned into a compass. When the song ended, foreheads met in quiet gratitude. And gratitude, too, has a sound, the hush of breath shared between two mouths that remember where they belong. There were storms, of course. Gentle love doesn't mean gentle life. An argument folded itself into a dinner once, sharp knives handled more carefully than words. The apology did not appear as flowers or gifts. It arrived as presents, as dishes washed without being asked, as the last slice saved for the one who ruined the evening, as fingers that found a wrist under the table and held, not tightly, simply sure. If love is a house, then forgiveness is the room that gets the best light, and the furniture there is always rearranged, just enough to make space for what's next. Some nights brought fear for no good reason except the human tendency to fear good things. What if this is borrowed? What if this ends before a person is ready to survive it? In those hours, the body trembled without knowing why, and a voice said softly, "Here, look at me." The kind of gaze that turns panic into prayer. Not asking for explanations, not demanding a smile, just waiting while the tremor passes, patient as a harbor. A mouth brushed a temple, and the quake settled. Sometimes salvation arrives as a single kiss that doesn't ask for anything in return. Seasons turned. The scarf worn all winter grew faint with the memory of breath trapped in its weave. Spring snuck in through open windows and found two people sleeping tangled. It tiptoed past to lay lilac on the sill. Summer stretched out the evenings until the streetlights came on like punctuation marks, gentle reminders that sentences must end so the story can continue. The body learned a cartography of freckles and scars, not as trophies, not as possession, but as a map of a country where citizenship felt like grace. Even now, that map is memorized. Even now, a fingertip can close its eyes and find its way. There were the ridiculous things that become sacred by repetition. The superstition about stepping on the third stair because it squeaked and woke the neighbor's dog. The way the window latch stuck and needed a tap with the wooden spoon. The single stubborn houseplant that refused to die because it kept being spoken to like an old friend. And there was the ritual of notes, paper scraps left under the sugar jar, on the mirror, inside the pocket of a coat. See you soon. Save me a corner of your day. Don't forget you are loved. Those notes taught the paper to be brave. They taught the hands that wrote them to say what the mouth sometimes forgot. Later came the quiet ache that arrives when two futures want different shapes. Love is not a cage, it's a key. There was no villain in that room, only two hearts counting the same blessings and reaching different doors. The decision wasn't made in a burst, but in a long exhale, neither wanted to acknowledge as final. A suitcase rested open on the bed without urgency, and clothing went in not as an exit, but as a blessing. Hands folded shirts like prayers. Foreheads touched again, and the silence said everything. Some endings are simply transitions that refuse to call themselves by their names. Time, that patient archivist, tucked memories into corners and moved on. Days learned how to be ordinary again. The chipped mug remained on the shelf like a witness. The shirt stayed in a drawer, its collar still softened by the old habit of fingers tracing. There were mornings when the body reached out in the dark, expecting a familiar weight, and found only the cool edge of absence. Even then, absence had a temperature, a kind of lavender, cold that didn't bite but insisted. It asked for acknowledgement. It asked for gentleness. Years turned the ache into an echo that didn't hurt so much as hum, a low note beneath the day. Walking past the market once, the vendor's stall looked different. New faces, a different awning. But a bowl of peaches sat at the front, bruised in the exact way that marks sweetness. A hand reached without thinking. The fruit's fuzz brushed the skin, and for a heartbeat the old metronome resumed. It was not grief this time, not longing, not even nostalgia. It was recognition. The quiet love had not burnt out. It had simply learned to live differently. It had become the way a shoulder relaxes when a certain song plays, the way a laugh chooses its exit, the way a room feels full even when no one else is standing in it. On a late afternoon lit like honey, a letter surfaced from a book that hadn't been opened in ages. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and winter. The handwriting leaned forward as if it were still in a hurry to be heard. Words unfolded without drama. You were the safest place. You were the kindest season. You were home. No explanations, no apologies dressed up as wisdom, only gratitude and a tender truth. Sometimes love leaves to protect the very thing it adores. Tears came, not bitter but warm, the kind that rinse the windows so more light can get in. The letter didn't reopen a wound. It closed one properly. In the end, love distilled itself into something so simple it almost felt like a secret. A soft pulse that refuses to stop even when the visible signs are gone. The chipped mug, the squeaky stair, the stubborn plant that still leans toward the window, ordinary relics of a holiness that never needed witnesses. The body learned to breathe around the past, and the past learned to breathe inside the body, not as weight but as warmth. If anyone asks where the story is now, the answer is easy, right here, in the pause between two heartbeats, where a quiet fire keeps the room lit long after the match is spent. Night taught the language first. Lamps dimmed low, streetlights sifting through curtains, and the small apartment becoming a chapel of everyday things. Porcelain mug on the sill, a tilted photo frame, the soft hush of the clock that always ran a minute slow. In that hush, closeness didn't need translation. A hand reached for a hand and the entire room understood. Knuckles, warm and a little rough, fitted into familiar valleys. The air itself leaned closer. Breath evened out, shoulders lowered their guard. Somewhere under ribs, a drummer found the beat and promised to keep time. The mouth didn't speak, it didn't have to. A thumb moved slow over skin, and that was apology. Fingers threaded, and that was trust. The space between two foreheads, leaned together at the end of a long day, held more truth than any well-practiced speech. A temple kissed once meant safety, kissed twice, home. And when laughter came, quiet, unforced, it rang like bells from another room, blessing everything it passed through. Morning delivered a second dialect, domestic rituals that felt like vows. A kettle clicked to life, the whistle softened by a palm over the spout, as if to keep the neighborhood from waking too soon. A slice of toast rescued from too much time under the coils. A spoon clinking against a mug 3 times, never 2, never 4. The pattern made no sense to anyone else, but there it was, affection disguised as habit. A plate set slightly to the left, the way it's always liked. A napkin tucked beside it, as if gentleness could fold itself into cotton and stay. On the walk to the corner grocer, conversation took the shape of strides that matched without planning. A shoulder brushed lightly and lingered. A traffic light turned red, and both stopped in the same half-breath, shared grin lifting at the same instant, as if amusement had been agreed upon beforehand. The city moved around that bubble of quiet understanding, buses exhaling, pigeons negotiating crumbs, a cyclist ringing a bell, but everything important happened in a small arc of space between two bodies careful with each other. Hands spoke fluently over fruit. The test for ripeness was always a thumb's gentle press, then a quick glance that said yes, this one. Basil lifted toward a face not to buy, but to remember summer. A peach settled in the crook of an elbow, its fuzz winking in the light, and a memory settled with it. Sweetness bitten on a stoop last July, juice running a line down a wrist and laughter following it like a promise. The grocer tossed in an extra as he always did, superstition, maybe faith, maybe both. Back home, the door clicked shut and quiet spread like warm water. Shoes landed in their place, his slightly askew, the other meticulous, and even that asymmetry had become a kind of harmony. Music low, just enough for a melody to breathe. Swaying began without a decision, a step to the left, a shoulder turning, the rest of the world going out of frame. The floor learned the choreography, 2 sets of feet finding the same small circle. The song ended, but the whole didn't, and that was the sentence the body had been trying to complete all day. There were days when the world arrived harsh, a call with sharp edges, a task that refused to bend, a mistake coated in salt. Words tried and failed, explanations spilled and only made more mess. Then silence came to do the mending. Fingers found the nape of a neck and stayed, breathing matched. The storm inside settled, not because anything was solved, but because company had chosen not to leave the room. That choice, repeated 1,000 small times, built a shelter sturdy enough to outlast weather. Illness brought a different grammar. Fever made thoughts float and sink unpredictably. The body asked for tenderness and water and patience in equal measure. A cool cloth pressed to a forehead delivered all 3. Broth steamed gently on the nightstand, spoon offered with the reverence usually reserved for prayer. In the half-sleep of healing, a hand counted the slow strokes through sweat, damp hair, and the counting became a lullaby. When dawn finally lifted the room, the first sound heard was the soft set-down of a glass and the whisper, unspoken, understood stay. Certain afternoons folded into themselves, quiet as pages, side-by-side reading, the kind of companionship that needs nothing, wants nothing, asks only to exist. The brush of an ankle against an ankle under the throw blank, it said still here. The slide of a bookmark into place at the same moment said still with you. Time stopped keeping score. Even the sun seemed reluctant to move across the floorboard, as if it, too, understood the sanctity of this ordinary sacrament. Not every closeness arrived kindly. There were days when anxious questions hauled themselves up the stairs uninvited. What if this goodness breaks? What if the future asks for more than can be given? Panic pressed palms cold, words tumbled into too much. Then, as if it had been rehearsed since childhood, a gaze steadied everything. Eyes held like anchors, the chest opened, shoulders unhooked from their ears. A breath went in all the way for the first time in hours. The answer wasn't a sentence, it was a presence. The answer was a hand that refused to let go. Travel taught the love how to translate. A train car full of strangers, metal singing against rails, and knees touching lightly in that borrowed seat. Heads tipped together not out of fatigue, but the sweet gravity of belonging. A window filled with towns that wouldn't remember these names and didn't need to. Ticket stubs were saved like relics, not because the routes mattered, but because a thumb had traced their edges while thinking of future routes and found courage there. Evenings with friends revealed another intimacy, the conspiracy of glances. Across a table crowded with plates and candlesticks and noise, a single look served as a conversation. Time to go, one more story. Did you meet joy today? The intent registered without effort. Inside jokes surfaced with only the lift of an eyebrow. If a sorrow arrived mid-meal, quiet and private, the brush of a knee under the table stepped forward to shoulder it, and the sorrow obeyed, grateful to be carried without spectacle. Forgiveness often happened without language. An impatient remark, a door closed a little too firmly, a disappointment that didn't deserve all the power it received. Later, in the kitchen, the olive oil poured more slowly than usual, and a dish arrived at the table that took an hour longer than anyone meant to spend. The extra hour said apology more elegantly than any speech. Plates scraped clean, hands rinsed, a tea towel slung over a shoulder. Finally, the simplest ceremony of all, 2 palms pressed together in the doorway, heads bowed slightly, warmth exchanged like an oath renewed. Time moved as it insists on doing, and the relationship between words and touch matured into something spare and luminous, fewer explanations, more witnessing. The person in the mirror softened around the eyes. The person across the room softened around the mouth. A shared map of kindness drawn in small, indelible lines. Photographs were taken less frequently. The moments felt whole enough without proof. What mattered most never wanted flash. On a winter night that smelled of smoke and cinnamon, a box slid from the top shelf of a closet, the kind of box that keeps paper and secrets safe. Inside, tickets, petals flattened to memory, a napkin with a doodled star, a note with a single sentence, for the days we forget how brave we are. The sentence belonged to both. Even the handwriting felt like a touch. It lifted from the page and rested on the skin, all over again. Inevitably, change arrived with its suitcase of quiet negotiations. Futures leaned in different directions, not because of a failure of love, but because love, when it's honest, tells the truth about paths. Tears didn't make a scene. They made a river that both sat beside. Hands held gently until the holding shifted from promise to blessing. When the door finally closed, it did so with reverence. Distance didn't mute the language. In the grocery line months later, a stranger's scarf unraveled to the floor, and reflex stitched it back over the stranger's shoulders, fingers moving with a tenderness learned elsewhere. On a bus, someone slept crooked against cold glass, and a jacket offered itself without fanfare. The intimacy that once spoke to one began to speak to the world, as if love had trained the hands for wider work. And then, one day, a letter surfaced where it had been waiting, a pocket of a coat not worn since last season, paper warm from the lining. The first 3 words reached across miles and months with the ease of a familiar hand. Everything after that was quiet thunder, gratitude, care, the gentle insistence that what was built remains, not as possession but as light. The letter ended. but the conversation didn't, because the body continued speaking in its learned tongue. Tenderness practiced as daily verbs, attention offered as shelter, presence kept like a promise. In the sacred space between two souls, language was never the point. Love was the meaning, and meaning, once found, keeps speaking. Letting go isn't a moment, it's a slow unraveling of everything that once felt certain. It begins quietly, the shift in the way mornings sound, the pause before a familiar touch, the echo that lingers a second longer than it should. Love still lives in the room, stubborn and breathing, yet something invisible starts folding it into memory. There is no betrayal, no anger, only the unbearable knowledge that staying might hurt more than leaving. That's the cruelty of deep love. It asks for courage even when courage looks like walking away from everything safe. The days before the goodbye were softer than anyone would expect. There were no fights, no slammed doors, just long silences that didn't need to be filled. Coffee brewed as always, laughter found its way through the cracks, and yet every smile carried the quiet weight of what both already knew. Love had not ended. It had simply grown too big for the small world it was trapped in. To keep it pure meant setting it free, though every cell of the body resisted the truth of it. The letter came later, but the goodbye had already been written in their eyes long before ink touched paper. The words were gentle, written with the kind of care only love could teach. You gave me peace, it said. You gave me a home inside my own skin, but I can't keep taking from the same well when the water belongs to both of us. It wasn't a confession or a plea, it was permission. Permission to breathe again without guilt, to let the ache become something holy instead of something heavy. Reading those words was like standing in sunlight after rain. It hurt and healed at once. Every line carried traces of a voice still known by heart, the rhythm of laughter, the softness of certain syllables, the warmth that lived behind them. It was impossible to hate the person who wrote them. The love was too real, too tender, too alive. The letter was mercy disguised as farewell, and in its honesty lay the deepest act of devotion. Memory became the new companion. Walking through the city brought ghosts, corners where laughter once spilled, benches where secrets were whispered, the reflection in a cafe window that still looked like two instead of one. But the ache wasn't cruel anymore. It became something sacred, a reminder that what was shared had been rare enough to mourn properly. Each place held a small piece of that love, and collecting them became a quiet ritual of gratitude rather than grief. At night, dreams refused to forget. The mind replayed moments in fragments, a hand brushing away hair, the warmth of shared breath, a half-finished sentence that still wanted an ending. Waking up left an ache in the chest that didn't fade quickly. But slowly, something shifted. The pain began to feel less like loss and more like proof. Proof that what had been given was real enough to leave an imprint. That love, when true, does not vanish. It transforms. Friends tried to comfort, speaking of closure as if love were a door that could be shut cleanly. But closure is a myth for the kind of love that lives in bone and breath. What really happens is quieter, the realization that loving someone doesn't require keeping them, that releasing them doesn't undo the tenderness built across years. Sometimes letting go is the final promise kept, the promise to protect what was beautiful by not letting it turn bitter. There were moments of rebellion, of course. The impulse to write back, to call, to say, I still think of you every morning. But love teaches restraint, too. The letter had not asked for response. It had offered peace. Answering would have broken that fragile grace. So the words stayed unsent, tucked in a notebook that lived beside the bed. They belonged not to the world, but to the silence between heartbeats where his memory still lived. Seasons changed with quiet persistence. The first winter without him arrived wrapped in gray. Snow fell in slow motion, blanketing streets that once held footprints side by side. But even in the cold, warmth found new shapes. A scarf pulled tight, a candle lit at dusk, the hum of a song once shared. The body learns to adapt, to carry love differently. It stops reaching for a hand that isn't there and starts holding the memory of what that hand meant. Years later, the scent of rain on pavement would still summon him. So would the faint hum of a song once danced to in the kitchen. But instead of sorrow, there came a smile, soft, small, private. The heart had made peace with its ghosts. They weren't intruders anymore. They were teachers. They had shown what it means to love deeply, to lose gently, and to continue living without hardening. That's the kind of lesson no new love can erase. One evening, the letter was found again, folded neatly in its original envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink faded, but the emotion pulsed as vividly as the day it was written. Reading it no longer tore open the chest, it filled it instead. The words carried the same kindness, the same restraint, the same fierce tenderness. It was not a relic of pain, but a monument to grace. In its stillness, it reminded that letting go had not been an act of abandonment, but of love in its purest form. Standing by the window, the sky bruised with the last light of day, it was clear what mercy really means. It means understanding that love isn't ownership. It means seeing that two hearts can beat for each other even as they walk different paths. It means knowing that some endings are too sacred to name because they aren't truly endings at all. They are transformations. The ache never disappeared entirely. It simply grew quiet, turning into a kind of steady pulse beneath everything else. That's how love survives, with humility, with distance, with memory. To have loved that deeply was to have been changed at the level of soul. And in the quiet after all the years, one truth remained unshaken. Letting go did not destroy the love. It refined it into something eternal, something that would live quietly inside forever. Mourning has a way of pretending nothing ever changed. The sun still finds its way through the same curtains. The kettle still hums its sleepy tune, and the floor still creaks beneath the same familiar steps. But the silence is different now. It carries his shape, his warmth, his voice softened into the air like a perfume that refuses to fade. Even after all this time, the world still smells like him, as if love has been absorbed into every small thing he once touched. Healing, it turns out, is not about erasing. It's about learning to breathe in what remains. The first days after he was gone were heavy with echoes. The sound of the door closing, the soft clink of his cup on the counter, each one a small, sharp memory replaying itself. The mind, unwilling to accept absence, filled the space with what it remembered. Laughter spilling through the kitchen, the way his hand would graze a shoulder when passing by, the way he always hummed before saying something important. These echoes became both comfort and wound. They hurt, but they also kept the love alive in a world suddenly stripped of his presence. Nights were the hardest. Dreams became a place of reunion. He appeared as vividly as if the world had never lost him, sitting by the window, sleeves rolled, looking out at the rain with that quiet half-smile that used to mean I'm home. In those dreams, no words were exchanged, just the closeness that didn't need them. Waking up was the real heartbreak. The pillow beside still held the hollow where his head used to rest. A small indentation time refused to smooth out, but even in that ache, there was something sacred. Love was still there, just wearing a different face. The days began to teach gentleness. Healing was not a sudden sunrise. It was the slow unveiling of light through fog. It began in small acts, making the same tea he used to drink, walking the same route they once took together, stopping at the old cafe where the barista still remembered the order. The ache never disappeared. It softened. Each routine that once felt unbearable began to hum again, not with loss, but with gratitude. Love, once loud and alive, had turned into a steady, living memory, beating quietly in rhythm with the days. There were letters that had never been sent, scribbled words folded inside a drawer, ink smudged by hesitant hands. They were never meant for him to read. They were meant to release what couldn't be spoken aloud. Sometimes the act of writing became a conversation with his ghost, a way of saying, "I'm still learning how to live where you no longer are." And sometimes, in those letters, the heart spoke not to what was lost, but to what had remained. The courage to love, to feel, to remember, that too was his gift. Seasons began to shift without asking permission. Spring arrived again with its reckless blossoms and impossible light. The park they once walked through bloomed like a memory resurrected. The bench where they used to sit was still there, weathered but standing. Sitting there alone no longer felt like solitude, it felt like continuation. Every petal that fell, every breeze that carried the scent of earth, felt like a whisper from something larger than loss. Nature knew what the heart was learning. Nothing beautiful ever really disappears. It simply changes its form. There was a day when his voice came back unexpectedly, not through memory this time, but through an old recording stumbled upon by accident. The sound startled the air, just a few words, ordinary, meaningless on the surface, but they carried a universe inside them. For a moment time folded, the years dissolved, and it was as if the distance had never existed. The heart clenched, then softened, as if reminded that love does not rely on presence to survive. It only needs remembrance, the kind that doesn't ache, but honors. Healing meant building a new rhythm out of fragments. Cooking for one, reading aloud just to fill the quiet, planting herbs on the windowsill he once called our little garden. And one morning, without realizing it, there was humming again while making breakfast, the same tune he used to hum. The realization came later, gentle and stunning. Love had not died. It had taken root inside, speaking now through habits, through breath, through instinct. The same way he used to love, quietly, fully, was now how life loved back. There were still moments of collapse, rainy evenings when the world tilted and the ache came rushing in uninvited. On those nights, it helped to light a candle and sit with the stillness. The flame would flicker like heartbeat, fragile but alive. The tears that came were not grief anymore. They were gratitude wearing the shape of loss, gratitude that the kind of love he gave could still bring warmth even from memory. The echo of what was once shared had become a companion, a teacher, a mirror of endurance. Friends said time heals everything. They were wrong. Time doesn't heal, it reveals. It peels back the layers of hurt until what's left is the truth beneath it. That love, when it's real, does not end. It becomes quieter, wiser, deeper. It hides in the spaces between moments, in the laughter shared with someone new, in the softness offered to a stranger, in the courage to begin again. Every act of kindness became a small echo of the way he once loved. And in that reflection he lived on. Years later, walking along a familiar road, there was a sudden gust of wind, carrying with it a scent that stopped everything. Cedar and rain, just like him. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough to know that presence doesn't always need a body. Enough to remember that the heart recognizes what the eyes can no longer see. It was like the universe breathing his name back into the air, reminding that love this deep is never really gone. It only changes how it speaks. Some nights, his name still rises softly between breaths, not as longing, but as prayer. The kind whispered not for return, but for peace, because love that has survived absence doesn't ask to be restored. It asks to be honored. The heart, once fractured, learns that cracks are not signs of breaking. They are places where light enters, and through that light, healing finds its voice. Now, when morning comes, the silence no longer feels empty. It feels full of echoes of lessons, of the quiet knowing that nothing truly loved is ever lost. The world still smells faintly like him. The days still carry traces of what was once shared. But they also carry something new, the calm acceptance that love, even when unseen, remains the pulse beneath everything living. Love never leaves, it just learns to speak through the echo of what remains. If this story touched something inside you, hold it close, then share it. Leave your heart in the comments, tap that like button to keep love alive, and subscribe for more real, raw, unforgettable stories. Until the next heartbeat, stay kind, stay open, and never stop believing in deep love.